everyone, and welcome to the DoubleBlind Magic Hour, where we cover what's going on in the world of psychedelics, from insider baseball drama within the rapidly unfolding psychedelic movement to the latest news on research, politics, and beyond. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Shelby Hartman, co-founder of DoubleBlind, a print magazine covering psychedelics, and today we're joined by Britta Love, a somatic sex educator, writer, and healer. Her work is focused on the intersection of conscious sexuality and psychedelic ritual with a through line of social justice and embodied consent. Britta, I hope I'm not gushing too much, but I think I just want to start by saying that I think you're a really special person. And every time I talk to you, I walk away learning so much. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's very kind.
You've been talking about psychedelics for sensuality, intimacy, embodiment for a long time. So long before it seems like it's kind of suddenly a hot topic in the psychedelic space. Like within the last 2 to 3 years, we've been seeing summits specifically focusing on psychedelics and sensuality and sex and intimacy. The big MAPS conference, Psychedelic Science in Denver, had a panel that people were spilling out of the room on psychedelics and sex. But 5 to 10 years ago, it was like MDMA for PTSD, psilocybin for depression. Like no one was talking about this at conferences. So talk to me about your origin story and why you have made this such a central part of your work.
For me, sex and psychedelics are just sort of like inextricably interwoven in my lived experience. I was I was 19 when I first started doing sex work in London. And that was like this like wild experience of like having boundaries around my body and sexuality for the first time. And so it was actually this like counter to a lot of the mainstream narrative, a really like a place of relative safety compared to some of my non-consensual experiences outside of sex work. And then I met a client who introduced me to psychedelics. And before that, I kind of was like, this was 2008. I don't know. It was a long time ago. And I was like very closed to psychedelics, but the way he spoke about them really changed my mind. And he's a dear client of mine. I've had many dear clients. And that was when I first tripped. And it was sort of like this interweaving of realizing that what I was learning about sexuality, both in terms of what my clients needed in order to relax and experience release and be more attuned to their body and their emotions. And what I was learning through kind of witnessing them and realizing that our experiences would be better if I could find a way to engage deeply with them as well, required this surrender. And that was exactly what I realized on my first acid trip, right? Which was that I was sitting there trying to kind of fight this experience and that I had no ability to trust and let go enough to surrender into this kind of a state, and that it really brought me like right up close to my anxiety, which I wasn't even really conscious of at that age. So this is like, up until my early 20s, this like kind of back and forth where I would like, without really consciousness about it, be having psychedelic experiences that then integrated into how I approached my work and my outside of work sexual interactions. And there was this kind of feedback loop. And I realized like now I could look back many, many, many years later that I was in this kind of integration practice. And so I was starting to experience more of the kinds of states that psychedelics introduced me to through sexuality without taking psychedelics. And that having that embodied practice changed my landscape the next time I went to go and trip. So there was like a feedback loop. And I think that's really, at some point along the way, it was very early in my sex work that I realized that this was healing work, that I was holding space for another person's experience of their body, their sexuality, and their pleasure. But it took me like 5 or 10 years before I really started going into training as a somatic sex educator, because I wanted to be able to hold space that was more consciously like clients were coming to me in order to do this work. But I remember at like one of the early, I think it was the first symposia conference that I went to, I had this talk that was about like from hookers and dealers to therapists and guides, because it was so clear to me that these were these roles that have been so heavily suppressed because we devalued these other ways of knowing and what happens when we surrender to the unconscious. And then, of course, like, it took me a long time to develop a little bit more discourse about what it means to create a safe space to surrender into that, and that surrender itself isn't always a great thing if we don't create the right container for it. So that's kind of been my journey, but the two have kind of been interlinked from the very beginning.
Wow, that's so interesting. I obviously have heard of this concept of surrender within psychedelics. It's a word that is particularly popular in sort of ayahuasca circles, underground plant medicine communities, this idea of just letting go and releasing into whatever emerges. And I also know from personal experience about the importance of being able to get into that state with a partner or partners when you're engaging in acts of sexual intimacy. But I've never really thought about applying the psychedelic concept of surrender to my sexual experiences, even though I can say that that is something that I have learned to do over time and which has enabled me to reach new heights of pleasure and trust and relaxation.
Absolutely. I think there's something so interesting about, like, in French, le petit mort, the little death is what they call the orgasm. And like, we talk about ego death and psychedelics. And so there's kind of a lot of ways where, even before orgasm, erotic trance, like, is, well, first there's arousal, which is actually an altered state. When we do something based on arousal and the next day we go, questioning that decision now, that's because we were altered, So it starts with that arousal. And then if we start acting on the arousal, we can find our way into erotic trance states. And then from there, orgasm is kind of like a peak or transcendent moment or imminence. We could talk about imminence versus transcendence as a model of understanding these things, but really a very potent, expanded state that kind of is some kind of climax or peak of that. And so there's like a lot of, I think you can map that to sort of microdosing, to some small doses, larger doses, peak experiences. And I mean, you could also map this to so many other ways of experiencing expanded states, but I find that sex and drugs are kind of the two ways that have been the most, criminalized, right? Stigmatized, made very taboo. We sort of laugh about them and have trouble kind of taking them seriously. I think the psychedelic movement is a big shift in that. But even then, there's kind of like a need to distinguish it from other ways of getting high or just recreational pleasure. Like, there's this bifurcation where we don't just trust that there's something of value to experience these other forms, like forms that our consciousness can take. So I think we're kind of like slaking off that kind of very dualistic Western Christian paradigm that like separates like the sacred and the profane, and like the rational and the irrational, and all these dualisms that like inform the value systems of our society. And that's why I think it's so potent to go to sex and drugs as the like thing that ties that together.
So for those of you who don't know, DoubleBlind began as a print magazine, and it's still at the heart of what we do. I spent my whole career as a journalist before starting DoubleBlind, reporting on psychedelics, cannabis, and drug policy more broadly for Rolling Stone, Vice, LA Weekly, Quartz. I did just about everything in journalism. I worked at CBS News, covering breaking news, a major newspaper, small media startups, and if you haven't heard, journalism is in crisis. But we started DoubleBlind anyway because we believe in the value of good journalism to educate and hold stakeholders accountable. We saw what happened in cannabis. Pioneers who put their lives on the line to get patients access to the medicine they needed, getting left behind because they didn't have the capital to compete in the newly regulated market. We've seen what's happened in mental health care and healthcare more broadly, whereby millions of people are suffering, don't trust their doctors, can't afford proper care, and just don't know what to do to get well. In our print magazine, we feature essays, investigations, photojournalism, and much more by world-class journalists who are going everywhere from the ayahuasca tourism industry in Peru to laboratories at leading universities. We're supporting people like you on their journey with psychedelics, and we're covering this movement as it unfolds. This is all made possible by our members who, in exchange for their support, get direct access to psychedelic experts to help them on their journeys of healing and growth, workshops, and a subscription to our beautiful print magazine. Subscribe today at doubleblindmag.com/membership. At the risk of stating the obvious, we're living in a time where there's a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety. And we can potentially attribute this to our work culture and the fact that worth is oftentimes associated with productivity and that people are, we're still living. It's so absurd to think about the fact that the 9 to 5 is even still a concept, given the fact that it came out of the Industrial Revolution and Ford and factories, as though, our bodies are even supposed to be sitting at a computer for the number of hours that they are a day. But we know that this stuff lives within our nervous systems.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes it difficult for a lot of people to relax, especially when they are in a partnership and let's say they're working all day, they have kids, yada, yada, yada. And then at nighttime, it's like, okay, well, turn on that switch.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Be in your body now. We asked you to deny it all day, but
exactly.
Now it's your time.
So I was going to ask, when you're working with people who are having difficulty regulating their nervous systems, having difficulty relaxing and enjoying their lives because they're stressed, they're anxious, etc. And they want to get to that point of relaxation with psychedelics, with sex, with breathwork, through therapy. Like they don't know how to get there, but they know they need to get there because it's really preventing them from being able to fully live their lives. What does that process look like for you, working with someone from intake to maybe they do or don't do a psychedelic and then onwards into integration?
Yeah, I mean, to me, everything's very individual. So people come to me for such a wide variety of reasons and things they're wanting to work on. But I like to work with people in the practices and the spaces that they've already created for themselves. Like we all have moments in our lives that we are more attuned to pleasure, whether it's like eking one out right before bed with the vibrator, because that's our 1 minute routine and we know that's going to get us to sleep and it feels good. Or it's like the one takeout that we get to like nourish ourselves in a stressful week or whatever it is. So I really like working with pleasure practices and encouraging folks to keep a pleasure journal and really create a mindfulness practice around where am I finding that sensual pleasure? Where am I slowing down? And how can I just gently allow it to expand and fill more of my consciousness in like the same way that we might approach really gently any kind of mindfulness practice. And one thing that I also love to do is to introduce the idea of the witchy wank, which is my favorite mindfulness ritual, which is basically, we have this like way that we take for granted that our spiritual practices like need time and space. When am I going to have my yoga practice? I have to show up to the mat every day. When am I going to meditate? But we don't take pleasure, like not seriously in that kind of like work way, but like in terms of like, this is a priority in my life and I want to create that space. So I love suggesting taking like 30 minutes. And this should be like in addition to your normal self-pleasure practice if you have one, but rather than trying to replace it, because that might be like really frustrating because you're trying to replace the place that's like an outlet that's your go-to. But to create this additional space of a practice where you set an intention to just be with your body and your pleasure and create the right container for that. So what music do you want to put on? Is there like a favorite album right now of yours? Like, what's the lighting like? Are you somewhere that's like soft and sensual? Do you enjoy looking at yourself in the mirror? Or maybe that's totally the wrong thing and you actually want to be like somewhere dark and not be doing that. And you just want to be feeling into your body and sensation. And the goal is just to stay with like breath, sound, touch, and movement for that half an hour. And just like in a mindfulness practice, you're going to find that your mind wanders. You're thinking about, oh, do I want to pull up some porn right now? Or like, what's like, how is my mind used to navigating, starting to feel pleasure? Am I clenching up and losing connection to the pleasure and actually kind of like in some ways fighting it? And just noticing that without judgment, back into my body. What can I do to bring pleasure again? And to just build our capacity for pleasure. And some days that might just look like dancing to the music in your underwear and you're not feeling very sexy. And that's beautiful. I mean, stay connected to your body, your desire and your pleasure. The idea is not to like push. And other days you might be bringing multiple sex toys in and having whatever kind of fun you want to have. Like there's just like just creating a conscious space that's like, my body and my pleasure are important. How am I prioritizing it? How am I telling my body that this is important? And to me, this is like foundational to more deeper embodiment, to better sex, to more joy in life. So that's my sort of favorite prescription. And I do a lot of masturbation coaching because it tends to be a place that we don't bring. I feel like we don't bring enough joy and celebration and give enough space in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and we don't give enough space in our lives to joy and celebration in general.
Exactly. So when people are coming to me, so I do somatic sex education work, which is working with one-way touch. If we end up working that way, we spend a lot of time working around empowering choice and voice, setting boundaries, like even noticing what our desire is and communicating it, which all is like very important foundational work before we involve any kind of touch work. And then it can move into one-way touch. I'm clothed. My clients in whatever state of undress is feeling good to them that day on a massage table, inviting touch only at their request, like very different from a lot of neo-tantra practices where people will decide, oh, I think this is the kind of touch that you need, or this feels like let me try this on you. Like no, we don't do that, right? We do very, very intentional. Like sometimes we're standing there for 10 minutes before a person knows, okay, yeah, can you place your hands on my shoulders now? And okay, what kind of pressure? We're like really attuning to desire and the unfolding of it. And then my other work is surrogate partner therapy work, where it's two-way interaction with a third party of a therapist. And that's for working more around like relational and sexual wounding in relationship. And so those are the two ways that I work around embodiment. And I like to think I take a very psychedelic lens to that. And sometimes folks are working separately with psychedelics as, back and forth, like I mentioned, as integration. I don't find that it's necessarily a wise move to try to do both those things at the same time with someone who's just beginning this kind of work. But yeah, I think that within those different modalities, there's different ways that people are connecting to pleasure, to relationships, to intimacy. We often stumble upon the kind of blocks to intimacy that we're all holding in different ways. Whether a lot of the work I do in either modality is around the wheel of consent. So people are often find that, oh, I have a lot of discomfort taking pleasure. I'm totally fine allowing people to touch me or like serving someone else and doing what they're asking me to do. But maybe accepting pleasure for myself is edgy because I can't relax. I'm like thinking about whether the other person's enjoying it or what I look like in this position or if it's going on too long or maybe I have no idea even what I want to take. And so we do a lot of work that's like foundational in both modalities where we're working just touching hands and like noticing what it is like to attune to like, how would you like to be touched and how would you like to touch me just on hands and forearms and seeing what that's like until we can really gain that kind of fluency and communication and our ability to attune to, there's like this whole inner process of like, do I notice that I have a desire coming up? Then do I actually trust that I've noticed that, like don't just throw it away. And then do I value it enough to then communicate it? And those are 4 different steps. And there's so many places along that journey where often we kind of lose the plot of following that, especially when we're socialized certain ways because of our gender or, certain class expectations or all these other sociological reasons that we don't ask for what we want and don't feel empowered in different contexts. So yeah, that's a deep dive, but there's just so many ways where this stuff ripples out relationally into our ability to experience pleasure and connect and have a better life really broadly. So it's not really just about sex to me. It's about, or rather, sex for me is about everything.
And tell me more about what you mean when you say it's about everything. Because again, at the risk of stating the obvious, a lot of the discourse within psychedelics traditionally, I'm going to say traditionally as in within the psychedelic renaissance context of psychedelics are becoming legitimized in this second wave of research in the United States, I want to contextualize that, is about psychedelics for particular mental health indications. But more and more, I've been having so many inspiring conversations with people in psychedelics who want to break out of that individualistic paradigm and want to put forth the idea that the spiritual is political, and that when we transform ourselves, that we see the potential for our culture to transform too. So sex isn't maybe just about your pleasure, your orgasm, but also about how you're relating to other people when you move through the world.
Absolutely. I mean, and it's political in a deep way because, I mean, I think it was Wilhelm Reich, I don't have the quote in front of me, who talks about how basically you can't have fascism in a population of people who are like attuned and empowered in their sexuality. Like there's something very deep about our sexual desire that's so potent. It's our life force energy. It's not just about sexual acts or things that we think of as explicitly erotic. It's like our creative force, our drive. And that when we live in a repressive society where we don't have easy access to our desire, to following it, where we're been trained from a really young age to deny our body signals, whether it's you have to ask before you go to the bathroom or you just do whatever it is that the doctor's telling you to do and isn't asking how to touch you. There's all these ways that we learn, oh, my desire is not important. My desire is not important. I have to repress my desire. Then you get socialized into, all the weird repressive stuff we have around sexual desire. And what you have is actually like a really disempowered and docile population who lack easy access to pleasure and connectedness, which is a resource for our nervous system, which allows us to build community, to feel that sense of like being held by something larger that's spiritually disconnects us because, it's our interwovenness. It's what connects us to all that is. It's our, and it's not just about, like, to me, it's like talking about like Audre Lorde's, the uses of the erotic. It's like she's writing about sex, but she's also not. She's writing about the erotic as a force that's like heavily, like, it's so potent that when we're attuned to it, there's no looking back. It's a revolutionary thing. And that's what drives me, to be honest. Like, I want everyone to have great orgasms and be able to trip and have beautiful experiences and to change our embodiment and our consciousness in this society so that we can build a better world. And I just happen to think that sex and drugs are two very enticing, interesting, and potent and profound ways to start to do that.
Now I want to get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty of what a practice around combining psychedelics and sex might look like for yourself, with other people. We have a lot of folks who come to us who say, I'm having difficulty relaxing and enjoying sex, or I'm having difficulty connecting with my partner during sex, and I want to do psychedelics to help. What psychedelic should I do? How much should I do? And I've always found it interesting that when we have workshops with you on this, your response is usually like something along the lines of, whoa, 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 slow down.
I do feel like, it's so individual. Like if you have a really deep ongoing relationship with a psychedelic, you've worked with it at so many different doses and so many contexts, you feel really comfortable, you're with someone you've been with your whole life, I don't probably need to slow you down. But so much of this interest is coming out of this very emergent movement that is kind of also very like, it's got a real fixie energy. It's like, oh, I've got this problem, and then I'm going to take this thing and it'll fix it. Well, that helped. Now I'm going to do it in this context.
Yeah, the sort of projection of the capitalistic mentality that got us into this situation in the first place, whereby people can't relax. And this idea that there's a destination and you're just going to take this thing and you're going to get to the destination.
Exactly. And so I think what's the antidote to the capitalism is connection and relationships. So I always talk about what's your relationship? What's your relationship to the substance? What's your relationship to your body? What's your relationship to the other body or bodies you're thinking you want to interact with? And those are all like beginning questions. I mean, I could say, yes, overall, a lot of people will find that cannabis is a really beautiful way to work more deeply with sensuality without going into a very big trip, but to like feel more in your body. I can also tell you like the names of 20 people off the top of my head who I personally know who that wouldn't work for because their relationship with cannabis is one that brings up more social anxiety, more self-consciousness, and that's going to block them from the whatever potential cannabis has to help them feel more in their body. And they might actually find that a dissociative like ketamine on a low dose allows them to get over some of their blocks around embodiment to at least feel more of their desire, even if actually, like physiologically, ketamine's starting to move us away from sensation as a anesthetic. Um, so I just think it's so particular to the person. And so what I kind of think of it as like juggling, like I start with one ball in the air, start with, okay, this is my building blocks of sexuality. This is how I know how to interact with my body and the limitations that I know are there. Okay, so maybe I do or don't feel great about my level of safety, my trauma history, my feelings of comfort and relaxation in a context with another person versus on my own. And maybe I'd make a decision about which of those contexts is going to be the one I want to interact, introduce a psychedelic into. And then I would think about my relationships with different medicines, like what's my relationship to cannabis versus mushrooms versus LSD versus ketamine? And, what experiences have I had? Where have I felt like I actually am in dialogue with this medicine? Like our brains like speak to each other, like our consciousnesses are attuned. I can definitely say that I've benefited from working with every psychedelic that I've worked with, and I've worked with, many, many, many at this point. But there are some that I have a really strong ongoing relationship with. Like we click, just like with people, right? And so that's probably going to be more of the medicines that I'm called to do work that's like a little bit edgier and more vulnerable for me. And I'm probably going to start with like a microdose or a very low dose in order to feel out the terrain. And maybe that's actually all I need to do. For me, some of the most powerful somatic openings have happened on really low doses of psychedelics. And I spent a lot of years in my 20s in this like kind of machismo culture of like the heroic dose and pushing myself to have the big healing experience that would surely come on my seventh ibogaine flood, and it was like, what are you doing? But no one was really questioning that discourse. And actually what I was doing was replicating my own trauma history, which was like pushing and pushing and pushing and never being good enough. And no, you have to work harder and try harder and trip harder. And if you go into the really intense experience, this time you'll deserve your healing and you'll get it and you'll win. And what was healing for me was to go, no, actually, B, like what you need is a low, small, gentle experience that you're nourishing yourself, feeding yourself with this connection without pushing the limits of your nervous system. And actually, some of the most powerful somatic openings and healings of my life really happened once I started approaching things more that way. So I think the reason I'm always like, whoa, slow down is because I just feel like there's so much unpacking we need to do about how we're even thinking about approaching this and getting all these kind of pieces, like kind of course correcting for some of the cultural narratives and course correcting for some of the capitalist narratives, like you were saying, so that we're thinking about relationships, we're thinking about our connection to ourselves, and we're moving at the pace that actually is in right relationship with ourselves and those around us.
Yeah, I appreciate you opening up about the ibogaine experience because I've experienced something similar on ayahuasca where I was just like, if I just keep drinking ayahuasca, eventually I'm going to get through to the other side. And it's interesting because a lot of times people will say no trip is ever identical. And it's true, each journey was slightly different, but I also was kind of having the same journey again and again for many years. I was just stuck in this thought loop of fear, honestly, because my first experience had been so terrifying that I was having difficulty reaching that point of surrender. Because as soon as I drank the medicine, I was like, oh my God, it's going to happen again. It's going to happen again. And I was perpetuating it. And I have been able to have some really profound experiences with cannabis because I trust cannabis so much. I've been doing it since I was 15. I don't think anything scary is going to happen to me. So I can smoke a joint in my bathtub and get to places that I was never able to get to on ayahuasca.
Absolutely. That's exactly it. And I think that that's one of those things. I remember I was asked to do one of the ayahuasca monologues. Maybe it was Evolver, someone was putting on quite a long time ago in the city here in New York. And I remember thinking, like, there's this kind of, even in the format of that, there's this expectation of having this like big story with this big dose. And like, there's just all these ways that psychedelic culture has really like focused on, if you do it enough, you'll push through and then you'll have this kind of a visionary experience. It took me a long time to realize that the way that my brain consciousness works is just not visual. So I was having these profound experiences working with Iboga, but I thought that I wasn't getting where I needed to go because I wasn't having visions. Where was my life review of every memory in my life being flashed before my eyes? Where were all these things people told me would happen, And so like, that blows my mind looking back, because what Iboga gave me was like a reconnection to my self, my soul, my inner knowing, and a sense of trust of being held in a web of relationships in the universe at large that is informed and allowed every other piece of my life to unfold and heal and fall into place. And yet I was still searching because I thought I hadn't gotten what you're supposed to get when you do an Iboga flood. I mean, it's wild to me. So I just really like to question narratives that get developed, especially by a society as profoundly sick as ours.
Right. Yeah. And that's another interesting parallel that I've never thought of before between sex and psychedelic experiences, the romanticization of reaching a point, right? Of reaching that life-changing orgasm or that life-changing ego dissolution.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's a slow burn, or sometimes you can get to that point, but the more attached you are to getting there, the further away it seems.
Absolutely. And like a lot of the time for trauma survivors who are used to like pushing through and enduring unwanted touch, enduring unwanted like experiences, like introducing choice into these kinds of sessions is actually far more profound than pushing through. I had someone administer 5-MeO to me, and I was very trepidatious about it because I had done so much pushing through very big experiences in my younger years that I was like, I don't know if I actually like the way people talk about 5-MeO is so like big experience, but I found a facilitator who was like, no, you're going to actually hold the vape pen. You're going to dose yourself. You can take one little puff and just see what that's like and decide if you want to do more. And I had a really, really beautiful, profound healing experience on a very low dose because I was able to course correct for many years of sitting in ayahuasca, sitting with Iboga, with facilitators who dosed me and didn't encourage my own inner knowing around what my body was wanting and what my consciousness felt ready for. And that just replicated the patterns of enduring that I had experienced in my trauma history my whole life. And that was actually a block to my healing, which is why I'm so like motivated about like bringing wheel of consent practices to psychedelic spaces, because I just know that, and I say that about these past facilitators, most of them, with one notable exception, were really beautiful people trying with beautiful, strong intentions. They were not abusive people, but they were working in a model that really wasn't trauma informed and assumed that people had access to choice and voice and didn't really have an awareness around how the power of them being the curandero or the healer was impacting my ability to navigate the situation in a way that felt okay to me. So one of the things that I'm really excited about is this year I'm putting on the first training for psychedelic practitioners to work on power and embodied consent. And Helena DeFelice from the School of Consent and I are putting together. It's like a 4-day training. And I think it's the first time that I know of that these two worlds are merging, because this is like foundational training for erotic and sexual practitioners, but it hasn't really made it to the psychedelic world, which has been
Wild,
so, yeah,
actually.
it is. When you think about it, it really is. And I'm like, we've been having these great conversations, and DoubleBlind's done a great job, like, hosting more of the conversations. I was really glad to do the High on Power article with you all, like, to talk about power and consent, but there's only so much we can learn through talking and writing. Like, it's in our bodies. We need to learn, like, how am I as a practitioner holding patterns of entitlement or submission that are impacting and interacting with my clients' embodied patterns of entitlement and submission? And how is this the, like, unspoken, unconscious way that these relational dynamics sometimes go really awry and end up becoming harmful, even when people aren't, have good intentions?
I appreciate you bringing this up because it's such a complicated and multi-layered topic. And I think, well, I think most people who work in psychedelics at this point are aware of the fact that there have been harms done, unintentional and perhaps intentional, by practitioners. But we still hear from a lot of people at DoubleBlind who really want to have a facilitated or supported psychedelic experience, and they just don't know where to go because, it's illegal in most places. And so there isn't a lot of education out there kind of in the mainstream yet about what to look for or about red flags. Can you talk to us a little bit about the ways that power sort of manifests within this facilitator and client dynamic? And, not just the obvious ways, like I told this person not to touch me and they did, but some of perhaps the more subtle ways too.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll just speak from the personal, right? I've experienced so many different times in my life that well-meaning practitioners have voiced, a projection that my partner and I needed to be having children, that they could see that the medicine told them. And
Wow.
I witnessed another...
What a thing for someone to say.
Right? Completely wild. And I witnessed another couple who were on those retreats with us in an ongoing way decide not to break up and have a child at similar advice from this couple. And I just thought,
whoa,
you're literally bringing life into the world. And this is all being framed so, like, within the, like, this is what life is about, and, in love. And, like, it wasn't like sit down and have a child, but it was like, that was the impact. The impact was, here are these people who we're looking at on a pedestal because there are healers and they're serving medicine, and they have this wisdom, they have this connection. And then they're telling me as if they know better about my life. And I mean, I think this is something that I notice, to be honest, with therapists all the time. There's therapists I've worked with that have more and less skill to the extreme, on one end of the spectrum to the other, of really holding space without being very directive, or at least if they're going to express an opinion, making sure that it's expressed in a way that is like, you hold this lightly. This is what I'm saying. This might not resonate with you. This might not be what's right for you. And I had another experience in a peyote sweat lodge before I even had a sort of narrative around the use of peyote and the ways that that to me now is something that is a medicine of a people that should stay there. But this was back in, actually, no, it wasn't peyote. Sorry, it was San Pedro. But back in 2011, I want to say, where I was sort of deep in this experience, which was very difficult for me. Sitting in heat in general is a big trigger emotionally. And at the end, they asked all the women, it was a very binary kind of model, to stay behind. And so I stayed behind kind of reluctantly. And as part of the prayer to heal the earth, the facilitator said, and to all the men who use the earth like their prostitute. And it was like a knife went into my chest. I was like, it was so re-traumatizing. Like all the social assumptions that there's like a way to treat a sex worker that are carry all of our patriarchal and oppressive ideas were just like thrown at me while I was in the most kind of vulnerable state of struggling physically with the experience and being heavily altered. And it was really difficult for me to try to speak to that facilitator about the way I was impacted. And when I did, it was really not well held. And so like experiences like that just really impressed upon me how like our own, it's like, I'm like, what is the set and setting for liberation? Like, what does it take to create a space where people are not being re-traumatized around their marginalized identities, re-traumatized around the lack of choice and voice that they've had generally throughout their life, where there's a possibility of guidance and holding, but there's like a deeply embodied model of consent happening. And so now I'm like, to be honest, there's very few people in the entire world I would trust to sit for me because it's really, that's just where it is. And I think that really needs to change because there's so much desire and need. And I feel like not enough training. And it took me years to figure that out. I mean, I traumatized myself working with some of these facilitators over and over again until I realized that not all facilitators are created equal. Like some have done a lot more work on their own projections and around the social constructs that are around us than others. Nowadays I kind of want to have a feel for, what a person's gender politics are, what their, whether they have peer supervision, who are they working with for themselves? Like I want to know a lot more. Whereas I think there's a scarcity model where, back in the day, and I'm sure it's still like this for folks who aren't deeply woven into psychedelic community.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like, I found someone, I found a facilitator, I can do the medicine now. And I know that's so tempting because we're all so desperate to heal, but it's really, really dangerous. And I also just want to be clear that I don't think that necessarily this becoming a model where there's clinicians like facilitating instead of a lot of what's happening in the underground fixes this. I mean, we know that 7 to 12% of therapists in the United States in an anonymous survey like self-reported non-consensual not non-consensual boundary violations of erotic touch with a client, meaning whether they thought it was consensual or not in their head, like that's just, we know, not okay. And then that's like the lowest bar, right? Of like, at least not doing that, within a container, never mind all these more subtle nuances about how we hold space. And so to me, sometimes when people are like, well, things are bad in the underground, but we're going to get the FDA approval and then we're going to have all these trainings. And I'm like, and so you're bringing the problems we couldn't fix in sober therapy, to psychedelic therapy, where this is, to me, it's incredibly dangerous. And it's heartbreaking because, there was a real innocence to the first decade or so of my psychedelic evangelism and enthusiasm.
Yeah, that's how it goes.
And now it's like, and it's been like that for a while. And then it's taken me a while to bounce back and be like, okay, well, how do we build the world that we want to see for facilitators? And like, how do we start changing culture around this? And I think it starts with these conversations and then people doing more of the embodied practices, because there's a big disconnect a lot of the time. Even for me, if I don't keep up with my own training and my own wheel of consent work, I catch myself all the time. I'm like, oh, wow, there's this very subtle way that I actually didn't create space for someone's choice or voice in that moment because I was in facilitator mode. And let me walk that back. Let me rephrase. Let me acknowledge that, because we're so patterned. I mean, our medical models, our healing models are just like very much like the doer and the done to, like, here, have this pill. Like, now you're going to do this, lie on the table. And we have to really reorient how we're thinking about healing and how we're thinking about what it means to be in a role that holds power and how to consciously give that power back to our clients like as often as possible so that they are attuned to the fact that actually the wisdom and the healing power is within the communication that they're having between the plant, the medicine, and themselves. And, we're holding that and we might have a role in that, mostly I feel like sometimes just from being able to share from my own experience that can help create resonance, but it's not directive. I'm not like some like wildly powerful, healer who's able to fix people and all these like weird models of healing that are out there. I think that like the healing power is relational and it's within. And the models of hierarchies in our culture don't don't really accurately reflect that, and it causes a lot of harm. Yeah, big topics. Deserves a big breath.
Absolutely. There's so much to say, and it's so complicated because how are we supposed to create a system that ensures that people stay safe and that facilitators are doing their own work when it's just so deeply personal? Like, you can't give someone a written test the way we do at the DMV to make sure that they're constantly checking in with themselves and holding themselves accountable.
It's wild. I think this is where like my work in transformative justice became a place that I really went to, because like developing cultures of accountability, which starts with self-accountability, but also includes like, who's my accountability pod? Like I have at least 3 or if not 4 people who I know I could text and say, hey, can we have a call? I need to check in. I got this feedback from a client, or I'm realizing I did something in a session and I'm not sure about it now. Can you help me, walk through it? And creating a culture where that's not scary to do. It's normalized because we're all going to mess up. We're all going to have these like edgy moments where we're not sure. And where we build community around doing that. And also, support pods for when we've been harmed. Who can we call and talk to about that? Who's got our back? Who's going to help us find a way to bring it up to the person's peer supervision or whoever it is, or the person themselves, if that's seeming, accessible. Like those webs of care feel like they're going to be a lot more able to hold the expansiveness of this problem than did they get licensure? What year did they renew? How much, ongoing education have they done? Because those are kind of like one and done. And they're working on the old model of ethics. So in somatic sex education, my mentor, Kath and Jesse, does this amazing teaching around how do we develop our living body of ethics, knowing that the ethics are contextual, relational, that my ethics 5 years ago are not the same as my ethics today because of what I've learned and how I've grown and how I've reflected, and that hopefully 5 years from now, they will be different too because of this ongoing evolution in our cultural and personal consciousness around what it means to hold these things well and what it means to do our own work and how we're understanding how these things are unfolding. And I think those things are scarier because we want certainty. We want to know, okay, this person's checked these boxes, they've done this training, and now I'm safe. And as a practitioner, I want to know, I don't ever have to make a judgment call. I can just look at the list of rules from my profession and be like, nope, I cannot touch your hand right now, And actually that there's inevitable like loopholes and complicities and unconscious ways that to work around those things that don't actually keep us safe. The gatekeeping like feels like safety, but it isn't actually. And we can just look around and see what's happening in the world that's full of those kinds of restrictions and ethical codes of conduct that are so inadequate because I think they lack this depth and breadth. That word felt very funny in my mouth. So that's kind of where I'm at. I want to have like webs of accountability and care, and I want to have an helping each other develop a deeply felt, like if it's embodied, then we don't have to worry. Like it's something that is just how we carry ourselves. It's an orientation towards coercion, towards choice, towards and so if we come up against like a weird situation, we feel in our body how to react rather than, oh, well, there's no official rule for this. So, now what,
Right.
And those things happen a lot on psychedelics, right? There's unusual situations that come up when we're sitting for people or, in the sexual realm as well. And so when we have that inner felt self to guide us, and then and then a web of accountability around us to help us reflect, I think that's going to be much stronger.
The inner web of self and the accountable. What were the phrases you just used?
That's a good question.
You're so poetic. The inner knowing of the self and the web of accountability.
That's it.
Yeah, which I think perfectly sums up your approach, the sort of the internal and the external, and the meeting of the two, and the negotiation between the two. I could talk to you all day. Unfortunately, we don't have all day. We will put the link to your training in the show notes, as well as the article that you wrote for DoubleBlind called High on Power, which gets into not only the tricky dynamics around being a facilitator, but also how these power dynamics have seeped into the psychedelic industry more broadly, and people who are not in the realm of facilitation, which is a just incredibly important conversation that we need to be having at this moment to ensure that the problematic politics that we see outside the psychedelic industry don't replicate themselves within it.
Absolutely. I think the revolution is embodied, will be embodied, came to me in 2018, right when Uranus was moving into Taurus. And I realized that like so much of what we want to change in psychedelic space needs to be reflected in how we're organizing our structures, our organizations, that the ends don't justify the means. And it's worth moving at the pace of trust and change in service of liberation so that we build things that are sustainable. So, yeah.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. So before we wrap up, I was wondering if you would join me for a couple minutes of meditation.
Yes, I would love to.
Hello and welcome. I'm Sky Weaver, resident facilitator at DoubleBlind, and I invite you into a little bit of breath work here today. So the breath we're going to use is coming in through the nose and out through the mouth. So we're going to inhale through the nose, a little extra inhale here, and exhale nice and long through the mouth. That's it. Again, inhale through the nose, a little gasp, and exhale through the mouth. Right, and on that exhale, just letting everything out. A couple more times. Inhale through the nose. Exhale. Good. One more time. Beautiful. And you can continue doing that as I explain just a little bit about this, that this is a beautiful breath practice that you can do to calm your nervous system. Anytime I'm feeling anxious about anything, in fact, preparing for this video today, I did my breath work. So inhaling in, one more time, and exhale. Soften that jaw and that tongue. One more. Nice, and just allowing the breath to return back to normal. Wiggling the body a little bit. I'm a big fan of wiggling. And welcome back. We'll see you soon.
Oh my God.
Oh, it's nice doing that on in a
stretch. Do a little stretch if you're not driving and you want to.
not operating any heavy machinery.
Don't stretch if you're operating heavy machinery. Britta, thank you for all of the years that you have put into doing this work, because you speak with so much poetry and so much nuance. And you're always a great reminder that the work doesn't end, that there isn't some fanciful destination.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Is there anything else that you want to share before we wrap up? Otherwise, you can just tell people where they can find you.
Sure. Well, there's a couple things I want to mention. One is that I'm in the process of gathering together some other pleasure activists to come together to build this campaign for a strike for pleasure. It's like a playful take on a sex strike. That's really an invitation to resource ourselves somatically for the fights ahead that we have, both in reproductive rights and at large in this country. So people can find out more about that at strikeforpleasure.com. And that's just like something I've been dreaming for years. I really want to move it out in this world. Sometime this year and next year, I think there's a lot of different offerings that are going to be attached to that. And also, I just want to make a big quick plug for Lysistrata, which is this amazing emergency fund that's run. It's like mutual aid by and for sex workers that has been running for many years now. And I made some art with my partner called Whores Are Healers. It's really sweet art with a heart. And it says Whores Are Healers, and you can buy all kinds of fun swag that says that and support this incredible emergency fund that helps sex workers all over the country when they are in a place of struggle and need some extra funds. They can apply for them and not have to rely on institutions that heavily discriminate against people who are marginalized through the laws against the criminalization of this work. And yeah, people can find me online at Britta Love, mostly on Instagram, but even better, go to brittaloved.com. So that's my name with a D at the end, and you can sign up for my mailing list because, as we know, Meta doesn't like us talking about anything fun or interesting or important these days.
Not.
So you can share things out, and every single thing I like to talk about is shadow banned at this point. So I put a lot less focus on social media and a lot more on connecting organically with folks who are aligned. And so people can find me on there and get my newsletter.
Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me, Shelby. This has really been a pleasure.
That was so interesting. And I just love talking to Britta. After we stopped recording, we were talking about sort of this metaphor of an escalator and how we live in sort of a heteronormative paradigm that places this emphasis on getting on the escalator and it ending at sort of climax or orgasm, but how oftentimes that actually diminishes the pleasure and eroticism of the whole experience because you're so focused on the destination. And I absolutely do see the parallels between that and psychedelic experience, whereby a lot of the media coverage we're seeing now around psychedelics is, someone is suffering in their life, they do a psychedelic and their life transforms. And this sort of perpetuates the narrative that, one or a few psychedelic experiences can completely change our lives, and that it's about those one or few psychedelic experiences rather than just the journey and how it will continue to unfold again and again and again. So I look forward to having Britta Love back, and I hope that if you enjoyed this conversation, you'll consider going on her website, checking out her work, because she has so many beautiful offerings. I want to thank you so much to everyone for listening. We really appreciate your support, time, and attention. If you want to read some of our incredible journalism on the fascinating world of psychedelics or get your tripping questions answered, we have so many free articles on our website, DoubleBlindMag.com. We work with absolutely amazing journalists and photographers who travel all around the world, interviewing indigenous stewards of plant medicines, researchers, therapists, politicians, and it's all made possible with the support of our membership, which comes with a subscription to our beautiful print magazine, access to a private community of psychedelic lovers, workshops with psychedelic experts, and so much more. You can give our membership a try for free for 1 month if you want to hang out with us and see what it's all about. Just visit doubleblindmag.com/free magic. We'll also include that information in the show notes. If you have thoughts about what we talked about today, you have suggestions about who should come on, there are many ways to hit us up. You can email us at magichour@doubleblindmag.com or visit doubleblindmag.com/magichour. If you want to partner with us and help make this podcast possible, you can email partnerships@doubleblindmag.com and mention that you heard about it here for 10% off 3 months of advertising. I just want to mention we only partner with brands we believe in and who align with our values. So that's a conversation that we're going to want to have with you. You can find us on all the social platforms at DoubleBlindMag. I also want to give a shout out to the amazing folks at Human Content who are producing this podcast and helping make it possible. They do a lot of great podcasts other than this one. So if you're an audiophile, check them out on Instagram and TikTok at Human Content Pods. For full video episodes up every week on YouTube, go to @DoubleBlind. I'm your host, Shelby Hartman. Special thanks again to our guest, Britta Love. Our executive producers are Aaron Corney, Rob Goldman, Shanti Brooke, and Alex Field from the DoubleBlind team, who also edits the show. Our engineer is Jason Portizo. Our music is by the lovely women at Oma. To learn more about our DoubleBlind Magic Hour program disclaimer and ethics policy and submission verification and licensing terms, you can go to doubleblindmag.com/magic hour. Now let's take you out on Plantas Sagradas by Nick Barabachano.
Groma hero pinta bueno Jai vi achara pinta kore medicina tai curandera.
Caminando por la selva, siguiendo la belleza, siguiendo las canciones de las plantas. Caminando por la selva, siguiendo la belleza, siguiendo las canciones.
Thanks for watching. And if you're thinking, gosh, I really need more DoubleBlind Magic Hour in my life, well, you can start listening now by clicking on that playlist button right over there. New episodes are out every Monday, so please subscribe and join us each week on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.